Pratt Whitney, we are wheels up. Our signal is Buster, to always go beyond. Introducing the F-135 Enhanced Engine Package. Combat tested, variant common, coalition assured, with $40 billion saved. Founded on grit and a legacy of innovation, we are 40,000 strong, turning brain power into air power every day. Pratt & Whitney, that's the power of smart.
皆さんこんばんは。同時通訳を聞くには、Zoom 画面右下の通訳アイコンで音声チャンネルを設定してください。主催は ISIC ジャパン、共催は JANES、制作はブルームパシフィックとバーシテック、支援はアルファベット順で BAE システムズ、L3 ハリステクノロジーズ、ロッキード・マーティンとレイセオンテクノロジーズ。通訳はフィールドとハーシーです。それでは、協力関係の力、多国間共同開発と共同生産というテーマで、防衛産業フォーラムのモデレーターを安倍政権で内閣官房参与の経験をお持ちの谷口智彦教授にお願いいたします。
ようこそ ISIC Japan のウェビナーに。
To ISIC. Thank you very much for your. This is our last. I would say it's the most timely of all that we've had this year. On Friday, and made an extremely well-organized announcement of a policy for future security. The Tempest Joint Development Program was also announced. This will be the sixth fighter system between England, Italy, and to be jointly developed. This idea place between leaders of the three countries respectively was announced simultaneously as a press release by each of them. At the same time, the U.S. Japan's defense establishment is one that is well welcomed by the defense establishments in Japan. The power structures become clearer and clearer. As we begin this, first of all, the new members who are supporting our endeavor, these seminars from Finland. The company has joined. Recently, the Ground Self-Defense Force has determined that it will be procuring land-based transport vehicles from Patriot. We also have from Singapore SDF who have joined us. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, Pratt & Whitney have also joined with us. I deeply appreciate and offer my warm welcome to them, these three new companies I'd like to express at this time. And our partnership, something which we will now be hearing great interest in ISIC. We have some very thoughts prepared in order. Those will be at the beginning. BAE Systems, Mr. Matthew Lauren, Warren. That was followed by King Massey, Mr. King Massey from Germany, and then from the US, Bob Moisey. Finally, heavy industries, Mr. Nishiyama, who has long been employed there, will be discussing with us. This is a very this conversation about representatives with very deep and long connection to Japan is something that has great timeliness. And also want to take on questions in the Q&A section. Please send in your question, Q&A. Of course, because of time, there are things that we will not be able to reach, we will not get to in the discussion, but we want this discussion to be one that goes on beyond this, not a one-off webinar or conversation. So please join in. I will act as moderator. But we ask that you join in the conversation and enjoy the presentation encounter. I now will turn the microphone to Dr. Matthew Warren.
Thank you, Dr. Taniguchi, and thank you to ISIC for hosting this webinar. I'm Matt Warren, Principal Strategic Analyst with Apache IX and former analyst at BAE Systems Military Air. I'm pleased to be presenting to you today on the topic of the Eurofighter Consortium's development of the Typhoon fighter aircraft. The Eurofighter program has been operating for nearly 40 years, and it is a good example of a broadly successful international partnership. From its long history, some important lessons can be drawn about the nature, challenges, and implications of multinational fighter aircraft co-development and manufacturing. Next slide, please. The Eurofighter Consortium was founded in 1986, 7 years after talks on co-development began. A long initial development program followed, leading to core requirements for the aircraft being agreed in 1994. The production contract was signed in 1997, and in 2003, the first Eurofighter Typhoon entered service. It has been used operationally ever since, forming the core fighter aircraft capability of the British, German, Italian, and Spanish air forces. The Eurofighter program is large and complex. As the diagram shows, it is governed by the 4 partner nations through NETMA and managed through the Eurofighter Consortium, made up of 4 industry prime contractors. There are 4 final assembly lines, 1 in each partner nation, and Typhoon's current order book is 682 aircraft. From Eurofighter's long history and experience, we can answer today's question. What does Eurofighter tell us about multinational co-development? Next slide, please. The first thing we can learn from Eurofighter is that the co-development of European fighter aircraft is not new, that it is difficult, and that the successes and failures of past programs shaped how the consortium was created and how it continues to be run. Eurofighter is the fourth European fighter aircraft to be co-developed since the 1960s. The first, the Anglo-French variable geometry aircraft, was an outright failure, and it was abandoned after 2 years. The co-development of the Jaguar ground attack aircraft followed. Jaguar was a partial success, but the program was opposed by elements of French industry who successfully undermined it. The third co-development was the multi-role combat aircraft, known as Tornado, a program involving Britain, West Germany, and Italy. Tornado sought to address the basic issues that had undermined AFVG and Jaguar through increasing multinational governance of the program. This included a separate international management organization, the formation of Panavia, a joint management company, and imposing high barriers on the partners to prevent them from exiting the program. This structure solved the earlier development issues, but in doing so, it created new ones. Costs increased, partner companies tried to maximize their own gains, and the time taken to make decisions increased. Nonetheless, the result was the manufacture of a highly capable aircraft through a multinational partnership. This proved that such a model could be successful. And it was the Tornado program structure that would serve as the basis for the Eurofighter program's own. Next slide, please. Eurofighter is an excellent case study on why countries pursue multinational co-development of fighter aircraft, based on which countries joined the Eurofighter consortium and which didn't. There are 3 principles. The first is market size and technology. In the mid-1980s, Germany, Italy, and Spain possessed neither the domestic demand or the technological know-how to pursue a national fighter aircraft program. They could develop with European partners, or they could buy American F-16s. Britain and France both had the demand and the industrial capabilities for national programs, but for reasons of cost, capability, and efficiency, both the French and British governments favoured European co-development. So why did Britain join Eurofighter and not France? The second principle tells us why. If it is viable, industry will generally favour a national fighter aircraft program to maximise its revenues and to protect its work share. Whether it is successful depends on politics and economics. In Britain's case, in the market-led, privatised defence sector, industrial leaders were disconnected from government decision makers. They lacked the influence to persuade government to fund a program and had to concede to the government's wish to join Eurofighter. In France's case, the partially state-owned defence industry, with its close connections and shared personnel with the civil service, had significant influence over policy and used this to argue that domestic manufacturing could only be protected through a national program. Rather than joining Eurofighter, the government conceded and funded Rafale instead. So why did the other partners join Eurofighter? The third principle tells us that the relative gains of partnership matter. Through Eurofighter, Britain could gain an expanded international market, the retention of its leading role in European defence, partners to share development costs with, and avoid reliance on the United States. Italy, Germany, and Spain could gain more through Eurofighter than through a direct American buy. They could boost domestic manufacturing, reduce their dependence on the US, and better compete with Britain and France in the long term. Next slide, please. The development of Typhoon shows us that there are some differences between the theory and practice of co-development in defense aerospace. Co-development should reduce the costs of a fighter aircraft program for its partners versus a comparable national program based on shared costs, economies of scale, and reductions in cost through learning. The reality is that fighter aircraft co-development does not achieve this in practice. Eurofighter's structure shows us why. In mitigating the basic problems of fighter aircraft co-development, it created new collective action problems of its own. These included work share agreements based on fair return, transaction costs of 4 nations with 4 bureaucracies, multiple production lines, the costs of technology transfer, and the greater formalization of rules, all of which added time and cost to decision-making. Despite these costs, though, Eurofighter has been highly beneficial to its partners. It has created and sustained over 100,000 high-skill, high-value jobs across over 400 companies. It has added research and development into other industries, created export revenues, and contributed to the formation of the European technology industrial base. Next slide, please. Finally, the experience of the Eurofighter Consortium and Typhoon holds lessons for the next generation of fighter aircraft programs. The European partner nations have split into 2 different consortia to develop 6th generation fighter aircraft: the recently announced Global Combat Air Programme and the French-led Système de Combat Aérien du Futur, known as SCAF. The rationale for 2 multinational co-development programs can be found in our understanding of Eurofighter. The same industrial considerations remain valid, and, as we've seen on Eurofighter, relative gains drive national behaviors towards co-development and manufacturing. States with strong positions looked to protect them, as was the case for Britain, Italy, and France. States with less strong positions look to improve them, as is the case in Germany and Spain, which may gain more through collaboration with France. And new partners like Japan have weighed the costs and benefits of a national program against those of multinational co-development. Lessons for the future include that program structures have long-term effects, as we have seen through Eurofighter. There will be trade-offs between efficiency and the benefits accrued through co-development, that the operating environment will change with program implications, and that the program must be flexible to its partners and to change. Which leads me to a final point on the new challenges that the multinational 6th generation fighter programs face. First, the 6th generation fighter aircraft are part of a much broader program, which includes uncrewed platforms and cloud-based intelligence. This is likely to have interesting repercussions for work share, based on how and where different elements of the system are developed and who integrates them. Second, there is substantially more emphasis on software, open architectures, and the digital space than there was on Eurofighter. This may break down some national barriers and solve some of the collective action problems. And third, the role of technology in manufacturing is changing. This will have implications for jobs, skills, work locations, and the comparative advantage within these programs. Next slide. Thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Matthew Warren、大変ありがとうございました。本当にタイムリーなプレゼンテーションだったと思います。伺いながら、すべてのことに関して初めての日本にとっては、学ぶべきことが山のようにあるんだろうと思いました。では、次のプレゼンターを紹介したいと思います。ティム・マティさん、ドイツから参加してくださいました。それではどうぞ。
Oh, thank you very much for the floor. I appreciate very much to give you a brief overview about the RAM program, about the rolling airframe missile program. First of all, I would give you a brief overview about the program, its history, and its core requirement, ship self-defense. Then I will go into key points from our perspective for the successful management of this program. Next slide, please. The RAM program has its origin in the late 60s and early 70s with the requirement of an inner layer ship self-defense systems on board ships. Therefore, two navies, the US Navy and the German Navy, committed themselves to develop such a weapon system for their last line of defense. First development memorandums of understandings, MOUs, were signed in 1976. A management program was established in Washington, D.C. With a true bilateral common lead and shares. So you find on a daily manner a US captain and a German administrator leading this program, reporting every half year to a so-called steering committee, to the chair heads of this program in the US Navy and in the German Navy. Next slide, please. First, I would like to give an attention on the commercial goal of the program. The commercial goal is so-called affordability, or let me say like cost savings. Therefore, the program established true 50-50 shared budgets for development, production, and maintenance. Supporting those budgets for production, both bilateral governments realize bundling procurements for missiles and launching systems. For example, latest kickoff budgets for production for the latest generation of the RAM missile were already established, bundling with the first 2 fiscal years for the US Navy needs and requirements. And further fiscal years support the continuous procurement for the program to support spare parts and maintenance skills, additional with bundling scenarios with international sales. For instance, also already established within the Japanese Navy. They procured the rolling airframe missiles for their big decks and for their new generation frigates. Beside this, there's no double line of production. This means that every contract will followed by subcontract the other part of the transatlantic cooperation. So every missile have a 50-50 work share in Germany and the other part of the work share within the US. And as of today, we have more than 250 launching systems and more than 6,000 missiles deployed, or they are currently under procurement. On board roughly 90 ships in 10 different nations. Next slide, please. The second goal is a technical goal, what we call reliability. So to provide firm solutions. So we have a continuous spiral development with different technical approaches and continuous reviews supporting the common development of such firm technical solutions. Once again, I would like to highlight the latest development of this 6th generation missile. We call it 2 Bravo. To fulfill the latest operational requirement, countering complex rate scenarios with new hardware and software, Germany supports this development with a new, more selective and sensitive IR seeker. And the US Navy established the development of a so-called missile-to-missile link for real-time battle management. At least there were 2 different approaches, 2 different technical paths forwards to fulfill this requirement, and both nations were eager that their own development would be conducted in this latest missile generation. Therefore, both technical approaches were realized. Next slide, please. The third goal, what I would like to mention, is a so-called lethality, or proven efficiency. Therefore, both navies conduct yearly firings against developing threats and challenging scenarios. Therefore, the program can rely on the US side, real-time test firings with their ship self-defense test ship. Both nations use several different types of targets to conduct those firings against sub or supersonic, sea skimming, diving, name it, waving, and stream attack scenarios. As of today, we conducted more than 660 recorded live firings in both nations. Next slide, please. And this comes, from my perspective, to the main criteria, main benefits of this program, and the ongoing challenges. I mentioned affordability, reliability, and lethality. However, I would like to highlight my personal perspective on the very key factor for this success, or the success of the program. And it's based on the very long common path within this program. It is very likely, I call it roughly a lucky punch, was established mainly through the tough first years in the development. So I mentioned very early that the first development MOU was signed in 1976. The production MOU followed roughly 10 years later, and the full operational capability was provided once again, roughly 5 to 6 years later. So it took a long term to realize this program. And during this development, certain failures occurred, and every time one party, either the US government or the German government, or even industry approaches, were ready to jump into these times with additional budgets, with a certain feeling and straight path forwards to overcome those hurdles and challenges. And this leads for me for the main keys of the success of such a program. It's a true partnership with equal liability and a solid confidence in each of those partners, government side and industry side. Thank you for your attention.
はい。Tim Massey さんのプレゼンテーションでした。
Jim Matthey's presentation. Thank you very much. With respect to the plans for joint development between US and Germany, we really appreciated the detailed information you gave us. I would now turn to Bob Marcy. Each individual who is speaking tonight has a resume which is explained in detail on our website. We urge you to refer to those, please. So, Mr. Marcy, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Taniguchi, and thanks to ISIC for a very timely webinar. I'm Bob Marcy, president of JDAX. I had the pleasure of working Japan programs for Raytheon for over 30 years, and I'm delighted to be here to speak about the SM3 Block 2A program. Next slide, please. The SM3 2A co-development program has a long history, and there were many precedents and gains. Overall, I think most observers have a positive opinion of the program. However, as with any large program, there were challenges and issues encountered along the way. I think understanding some of these issues and what caused them will hopefully help future programs become more efficient and effective. Next slide, please. The roots of the program can be traced back to the early 1990s, when Japan industry took part in what was called the Westpac study. Then in 1994, the US and Japan worked together on the bilateral study on BMD, which took a look at architectures and what a Japanese missile defense system architecture would look like. In 1999, a year after North Korea launched a missile over Japan, the US and Japan agreed to a cooperative research program that focused on missile defense technologies to advance a near-term capability for the missile being developed for Navy theater-wide program. Note the word near-term because this was 1999. In 2006, the US and Japan agreed to jointly develop the SM3 2A with an approximate 50-50 split and mostly aligned with their prime's capabilities. Lastly, in June 2020, MDA announced that the Block 2A was ready for production. Next slide, please. So looking at a huge program like this, what did the program get right? Well, there were a few things. First and foremost, it produced a game-changing interceptor for missile defense. It established a precedent for both countries to work together on a major defense program with critical, immediate needs for each country. It established new technology to further develop missile defense capability. It also provided an alliance boost and demonstrated to China and Russia how our two countries could work together to develop and field state-of-the-art technology and missile defense capability. It provides both countries with an interoperable solution with established performance capability. It established a precedent for Japan industry to provide production work share for a major US defense program. It provided a better understanding of the capabilities of each country and their industry's capability. And I'll say more likely, an acknowledgement and respect from the US side for Japan's capabilities. The program provided the potential for future upgrades and spiral development, and the potential for these assemblies to be used on other programs. Lastly, it strengthened the industry-to-industry ties. Both companies worked closely together, produced parts that needed to come together and work in a complex missile defense system. Conversely, what did the program get wrong? And what were some of the issues? The three major items that stick out are timeline, cost, and quantity. First, timeline. When it takes 20 plus years to research and develop technology, it is likely that the threats and the world have changed. The timeline has to be shortened. An architecture designed to deploy initial capability quickly should be followed up with future capability upgrades. Costs. I can't go into specific individual missile costs, but it is well above the initial program estimates. Drivers were requirements, development delays, funding, budget cycles, stovepipe, and quantities. So lastly, quantities. Production quantities are expected to be well below initial estimates. Over 500 missiles were projected for the US alone. There were additional quantities planned for Japan, and there were expectations of deliveries to international countries. The current potential might be closer to 100 to 200 missiles. Next slide, please. Issues and challenges. There were a few. First, program structure. The program had separate country management teams. They allocated work share and resourcing separately to their country teams. Results were communicated through regular and irregular joint committee meetings. This contrasts with most joint acquisition programs where a joint program office blends resources and enables continuous interactive dialogue. As problems arose and decisions delayed, they were kicked down the road and became bigger issues later. Policy issues, and this is for both sides. Known policy issues were not resolved when the program was initiated. This caused delays later in the program and caused roadblocks that needed immediate senior government level policy action. Industry to industry structure. As part of the structure, the industry teams were mostly bystanders. The government entities decided the details and provided directives to their respective primes. These were separate, siloed operations. There was no direct contracts between the primes during the development stage. Each company had their own requirements, and contracts flowed down by their respective government customers. The details for the integration were decided through a bureaucratic structure called a Joint Technical Working Group. This group was hosted by the government agencies, but were also attended by the primes and Johns Hopkins. It was the primary means for setting formal technical requirements for the assembled parts to work together. This is neither efficient nor an effective way to operate. Requirement settings. The requirement needs were enormous. The structure to handle these were the Joint Requirement Working Group. This was initially set up to handle the baseline requirements, but this working group continued to operate throughout the life of the program, up to the manufacturing phase. This can be seen both as an advantage as well as a disadvantage. Constantly changing requirements will delay a program. On the flip side, fixed requirements established early on might not keep pace during a 15 to 20-year timeline. The issue really here is the timeline from the start to finish. With a short timeline, baseline requirements might be sufficient for near-term production and deployment. The next issue, cost containment. The program had a joint cost working group. Most observers felt this was not taken seriously. Target price was set at missile number T100, even when it became apparent that missile quantities would never reach original estimates. Cost containment and initiatives by industry were not transparent and were mostly ignored. Cost became a serious issue when pricing for the first 17 test rounds. Difficult negotiations were required by industry to accommodate customers' budgets. Cost continues to be a concern with the program. So how could some of these issues be addressed and improved for future programs? I'll sum it up with a quote from President Ronald Reagan, the originator of the Strategic Defense Initiative. He said, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I clearly admit to my industry bias, and I feel more responsibility and authority should be given to industry. But I also recognize and understand strong leadership and vision by our government sponsors is not only warranted, but needed. So here are a couple of suggestions. For the SED program, the government team had outsized roles. A much smaller joint program office should be the goal, with set objectives and program vision. Industry primes for both teams should be deeply involved with establishing responsibilities for each country and industry team, with capabilities aligned to their participation. Government authorities should not dictate responsibilities to their primes. Most defense industry companies are risk adverse. Performance and behavior can be incentivized via contractual requirements. There should be strict adherence to baseline requirements. Performance, acquisition quantity, costs, and most of all, schedule. The Joint Program Office should provide oversight, initial requirements, funding stream, and shared resource allocation. Bloated, siloed bureaucratic involvement slows the process and hinders the flexibility needed to address issues quickly as they arise. Industry players should have a direct contractual relationship with clear statements of work and work share. Major subcontractors should be involved. There should be clear and transparent industry program responsibility. Ideally, in a program such as the SCD, there should be joint system design authority between the primes to negotiate requirement budget allocations. Lastly, establishing an open and working two-way technology sharing release authority, something similar to an industry-to-industry e-room to allow for real-time, or at least near real-time, technology and information sharing. Current government-to-government disclosure authority procedures can be cumbersome and time-consuming. I think I've reached my time limit, so I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you.
はい、ボブ・モリシーさん、どうもありがとうございます。
thank you, Bob Marcy, very much. To date, we have discussed 3 cases that we've heard our speakers talk about, and each of them had a lot of concrete details and I think suggest many things to us. Based on these points, I would now turn to our Japanese defense contractor, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. And our speaker has been involved in missile development for a long time. That is Mr. Nishiyama. We would love to hear your observations and sharing of thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nishiyama. I was involved in missile development at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, introducing the Patriot and our ballistic missile defense. So there were 3 examples just presented. I have also prepared a presentation, so let me start by giving it to you. In this ISIC webinar, we're talking about multinational co-development and manufacturing. But let me first try to summarize Japan's situation for you. Next, please. This is Japan's arms export policy and a chart of its history. I believe you are aware of this. In 1967, the so-called 3 principles of arms exports were adopted. They're basically, substantively, they mean that export of arms is in principle not allowed. So even though it's called 3 principles, I thought of it as 1 principle. Finally, in 2014, a new policy was created, the 3 principles on transfer of defense equipment and technology. Exports of arms became possible. However, there were many restrictions and there was not much growth. An American researcher said the following. So there's a proverb in Japan that says 3 years on a rock. But how long will it take me to export? Probably 10 years. I remember being told that on one occasion. Then now in 2022, 8 years later, just this week, the government of Japan has published the 3 strategy documents: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and the Defense Program Plan. These 3 documents represent a very big change for Japan. They include counterstrike capabilities, which is the first time the government of Japan has made this clear. And there's another element that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it relates to the use of official development assistance. In order to cooperate and to achieve greater international prosperity, ODA will be used. It's okay to use ODA in the framework of national security. This is new. And promotion of transfer of defense technology. This is to be brought to the next stage. Export of defense technology and international cooperation in this area the door has been opened wider. Next page, please. Now this page shows, for your understanding, a summary of what has been done so far. After 2014, what was actually exported? Well, there were a lot of details, but three main examples. Patriot Seeker gyros to the US, a TC-90 trainer aircraft to the Philippines, and then 2 years ago, radars to the Philippines. And helmets and bulletproof vests have been provided to Ukraine. The radar was the largest export. And there's a large box here with an X on it. Tanks for Turkey, a seaplane for India, submarines for Australia. We have not been able to realize these exports. Next page, please. Now, let me now touch on what the situation is for development and procurement. So there's normal imports or direct commercial sales, which means to import a finished product, E767, C130. There are lots of other examples, but those are two representative examples. And the second type is FMS, foreign military sales, and the examples are the E2C and the SM2 missile, also importing finished goods. And then there's a lot of work in Japan that I was involved in directly, and it applies to the Patriot system or the F-15 aircraft, the F-4 aircraft. Before that, many other examples. And this involves getting a license and then doing production in Japan and delivering to the Ministry of Defense, the Self-Defense Forces of Japan. If there's another type, it would be co-production, but Japan does not have this kind of experience. Cooperative R&D, cooperative production. With the US, I said bilateral here. The F-2 aircraft, yes. And Mr. Morrissey talked about the SM-3 Block 2A just now. And Japan does have experience with bilateral cooperation with the US. At the bottom is indigenous production. Aircraft, fighters, cargo aircraft, helicopters, tanks, various kinds of missiles, AAMs, SSMs. Many types of missiles have been developed. And then ships, destroyers, submarines, and other ships. So there are a lot of systems that were developed indigenously in Japan. Over on the right, on multilateral cooperation, I think there are two types, and that's why I wrote them separately. First of all, multilateral, led by the United States. And the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, I think, is the representative example of multilateral cooperative development. And then the rolling airframe missile Mr. Matty talked about was done bilaterally. I don't know if it could be called US led, but we also heard about the Eurofighter and Typhoon. There is the sort of cooperative development that's done in Europe, such as the 400M aircraft. What do we face now? As a global combat air program, Japan's next fighter, the UK, Italy, and Japan will have decided to trilaterally develop a new fighter. Multilateral European development and production is something that Japan will have to study. Thus, today's topic, as Japan goes about co-development, will be very useful, I believe. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, Japan changed its national security policy in a big way just last week. And we are just we are witnessing this big change, and I believe that the direction that will be taken is an expansion of defense technology transfers. And as I mentioned, Japan's FX fighter program will be with European countries. Multilateral co-development in an open world, which is where we are. That's the way we see it. Defense equipment cooperation with allies and like-minded countries should be increased. This concludes my presentation.
Nishiyama-san, thank you. From the three presentations, there were many, many things I think that that you mentioned we could learn, Mr. Nishiyama. If there was one in particular that came to your mind, I would like to hear about that.
Right. Just if I only had one thing to say, it would be, this is really tough. So what's tough about it? You listen to Mr. Morrissey. Even bilaterally, costs and schedules and other management issues were tough. If you look at the history of the Eurofighter, Europe's experience with several different types that they experienced. Now they have a multilateral development that they're doing for the Eurofighter. And for the new fighter, these lessons, I hope, will be shared so that we can pursue our new project efficiently.
Thank you. Going forward, I would like to now move into Q&A. Anyone who has a question, please write it into the Q&A section, and we would ask that you do so as briefly, as concisely as possible. As those questions are coming in, I have a question I'd like to particularly ask Matt Boren. With respect to engineers with different cultures and different languages, what is necessary for them to make error-free designs? For example, is model-based systems engineering, MBSE. tools like this, are those important for use in design?
So an excellent question, excellent point. And I would probably come at it from two angles. One is the development of such that was necessary over the history of the Typhoon program through Eurofighter, that these tools and ways of working had to be developed, but they were, I suppose, found their grounding in the Tornado program that preceded it. So Europe has a long history, particularly between Britain, Germany, and Italy, of working collaboratively in this space. And the second thing I would add is that the rapid changes in digitization and collaborative working over distributed sites and distances and teams is something that is going to be central to the next generation fighter aircraft programs, to such an extent that it does have the potential to make these programs less problematic than the problems that Eurofighter faced in terms of its complexity and some of the cost and time penalties that were felt.
はい、ありがとうございます。いくつか質問が寄せられていますが、
Thank you very much. We have several questions that have come in. Scott Seefeld has asked a question to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Mr. Nishiyama, looking at this, if you may look at the question and write an answer or answer through the mic. Phil Williamson said, has asked about the supply chain resilience. Anyone who would like to answer this in briefly? Supply chain resilience?
This is Nishiyama speaking. So the question does say for MHI. I'm not in a position to speak for MHI. So rather than answering directly, but the second thing that was mentioned by Mr. Warren, I think, is related to this. Namely, all of us, looking at the Patriot, introducing it, and BMD at MHI, at the beginning, we didn't have email even. We were just starting to use fax machines. Communications was really tough. So we used fax machine, and then we started using emails. Just text. Even with Mr. Morrissey, I remember exchanging emails that could only include texts. And on the telephone, it was satellite communications, so there was a delay. Now we have this Zoom program. We can share photographs, even videos, thanks to the internet. And Taniguchi-san always says this. We have communication in this age that overcomes the barriers of time and space. So for multilateral international cooperation, I think that the structures are in place to facilitate it. Perhaps it's an optimistic answer, but I don't mean to suggest that it's easy because the systems themselves are getting more complex. Thus, there will no doubt be challenges, but if you just think about what I mentioned, we're in a different era now. I really feel that strongly recently.
はい、ありがとうございます。今の西山さんのコメントに対
Thank
して、
you. As to Mr. Nishiyama's comments just now, do you have something that you would like to say, Mr. Morrison, in particular?
Yes, I think on the question on COTS and related to defense procurement from Japanese dual-use products and how they could be used in defense equipment. And, you know, I see a couple issues, certainly easy to overcome, but one is policy and the other is structural. In this particular case, most of the Japanese defense companies are large conglomerates. They have a disproportionate commercial side with usually a relatively small defense side. And there's very little sharing between the two. They tend to be run separately, and the commingling of information and management is almost 100% separate until you get to the top, the president level. So I think one of the challenges would be to leverage in some of these large companies the products that they have and try to move them towards, I'll say, a defense program. The other is policy. You know, once an item is being considered for defense, there are certain hurdles that a Japanese company would need to go through to make that part available for export. Clearly, a commercial part has a much easier path than a strictly defense part in getting through their export control to be used. But I do agree with the person who asked the question, Mr. Ross, that Japan has an incredible potential with their highly technical commercial industry with a lot of different parts that could be used for defense application.
はい、ありがとうございます。チャットボックスの方に一つ
Thank you very much. We have a question in the chat box. Japan, UK, and Italy, each of them will have burdens for work sharing and costs. How is that going to be worked out? I don't think anyone, honestly speaking, has talked about that yet today. At the same time, the main contractor, Mitsubishi, and the Self-Defense Force Equipment Division, as to how they will coordinate is still not something that we have any insight into. How about you, Mr. Nishiyama? Do you have some insight?
You're absolutely right. It's still in the stage of government-to-government negotiations. So what will it look like in the end? How many planes does each country plan to buy? These kinds of factors will, I think, affect the result. And then which countries will make which portions? Was it the Eurofighter? It was the Eurofighter that we were talking about, the final assembly line. So will each country have an assembly line? Or will some countries just make parts and those parts be assembled somewhere else? So there are all kinds of factors that could produce very different conditions. What do you think, Mr. Warren?
Dr. Warren, いかがですか?
Dr. Warren, what do you think?
Thank you. Yes, I'm nodding along because the lessons of Eurofighter, I think, do offer quite a lot of guidance for this new generation of aircraft. And actually, one of the principles of work share on Eurofighter of fair return was exactly that, based on a nominal number of aircraft to be built for each country. And that determined a large amount of the work share on the program. Over several decades, this actually proved hugely problematic because the numbers of aircraft being ordered changed, amongst other things, but also the distortions it caused in industry because it required the transfer of work into countries and industries that were not ready for the transfer of such work. This added enormous amount of cost and time to get those facilities, those industries, up to the standard required. So it was a really quite inefficient way of attributing and apportioning work share. This should hopefully be avoided, but I appreciate that the political pressure to ensure a domestic return for participation in any multinational cooperation co-development is essential, and therefore there will be pressure to have 3 final assembly lines and to ensure that a proportionate amount of work is allocated. But if it can be done on more of a comparative advantage, industry advantage basis, this will be overwhelmingly beneficial for the program over the long term. Thank you.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。Tim Massey さんには、
Thank you very much. I would like to ask for a closing comment on this from Mr. Massey. Let us know your thoughts. And then I myself have an additional question. On this instance, UK, Italy, Japan, new next generation fighter, the US and the Japan defense ministries approved this. The next generation FSX program is something that which compared to the US somewhat nervous reaction. Marcy, Mr. Marcy, you've been observing for many, many years. What do you think about the changes in this area?
Well, there's a lot that's happened in the past few years. I think the opportunity for the new program with the UK, the 6th generation fighter, it's bigger than just the program itself. I think there were many reasons why Japan decided to go with the European fighter, and that is not just for technology and I'll say risk sharing, but also for I'll say what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is looking for, security alliances. And the same reason that the U.S. worked with Japan on the SM-3 Block 2A, it builds very tight relationship with the governments, the defense industry. And so I believe that this particular program, when you look at it in its entirety, is a huge benefit for both countries. The primes from both countries are extremely capable. When you start sharing not only resources, but technology and also funding, it just makes perfect sense. And I think the US had certain challenges in trying to share technology just with their own bureaucratic issues. And some of the ones I mentioned in my brief, I think some of those are not as much of an issue when you go into the cooperation for the next generation fighter. So those are my comments. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。質問がいくつか届いておりますけれども、すべて
We have several questions. Thank you very much. I would like to bring up at this stage. There are some questions that we will not get to, I believe. For Tim Massey, How does this dialogues that we've been having sound from Germany's standpoint? We'd like to hear about that.
Thanks. Perhaps I would like to make a comment what Dr. Warren told about initial work share within a multinational program based on different procurement numbers. In this case, we are facing in the RAM program not that kind of requirement. So there's a true 50-50 shared, and there's no backwards evaluation regarding the total procurement over one of the generation. So I can imagine that this would be troubling. Knowing this, for instance, in a different program, we are also involved, the so-called ESSM program, Evolved Sea Sparrow Missile Program. And there we are facing the same trouble that, for instance, the partners in this program using higher numbers for the initial procurement on papers, vice versa, to not fulfilling these procurements later in this issue. So I can imagine those kind of trouble, especially then for the industries. In this case, I have no clue about how to solve this. What I only can recommend is on a bilateral level that there's a time when everyone or one partner shall be jump into the main part of an approach to fulfill or to finalize developments or productions or vice versa. So a kind of trustful partnership. And in this case, just two partners are much easier to manage than, for instance, 3 or 4 or multinational partners, 8 to 10 partners. So recommendation from a German perspective is keep the group of such programs in the very first manner as small as possible.
ありがとうございました。さて、
Thank you.
FIFA のワールドカップを引きますと、
Taking the example of the FIFA World Cup, Korea, our neighboring country, is already in the best 16 defense exporters, but Japan has not even joined in that World Cup. We have very, very limited export of, I would say we're not even in kindergarten on the export of weapons for 10 years. Can we really bring up good examples that we can offer for the last 10 years? It's very important, I think, for predicting the future of such exports. We appreciate the 3 presenters and Mr. Nishiyama, who has frankly discussed the Japanese situation. I thank all of you very much. And now this is something which I say each time. I want to thank the technical team, all of them, and show our appreciation, and to our interpreters who try their best to overcome the language barriers, Mrs. Hersey and Field. We want to thank our 2 interpreters as well. And with that, I will bring this session to an end. Thank you again for your participation, everyone, and please enjoy a great holiday season and New Year. And let's meet in the New Year. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.